Hello, everybody. Dr. Z here. We are in World War II, Part 2. So, in this time, we are going to be talking about the Pacific theater of war. So, the information for this and the following slide come from Columbia University. The great powers not only were protective of their special economic rights within their colonies and their spheres of influence, but they also sought to bolster their sagging economies through high tariffs, dumping of goods, and other trade manipulation. The Japanese, one of these great powers, had few natural resources, and they sought to follow this pattern likewise. So they used cutthroat trade practices to sell textiles and other light industrial goods in the East Asian and and United States markets. And they severely undercutted European manufacturers, particularly British ones, in doing so. They also developed sources of raw materials and heavy industry in the colonies that they established in Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria. And Japan used these high tariffs to limit imports of American and European industrial products. And so this sort of sets up the economic purposes of the war. Japan's expansion into East Asia began, though, in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria and continued in 1937 with a brutal attack on China. On September 27th in 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Act with Germany and Italy, thus entering into the military alliance known as the Axis powers. And seeking to curb Japanese aggression and force a withdrawal of Japanese forces from Manchuria and China, the United States imposed economic sanctions on Japan. And faced with severe shortages of oil and other natural resources, and driven by the ambition to displace the United States as the dominant Pacific power, Japan decided to attack the United States and British forces in Asia and seize the resources of Southeast Asia. So here's a photo from the Tripartite Pact between Japan, Italy, and Germany, formalizing the Axis powers, saying that any country not currently in the war which attacked an Axis power would then go to war with all three of them. Japan engaging and pulling the United States into the war, famously is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I highly recommend you read the book Facing the Mountain. I read this just this past summer. Fantastic research on Japanese American military personnel and their experiences. And the first pages of the book are all about what Japanese Americans saw and experienced that day as civilians and as military personnel in Hawaii. And it is just a fascinating book that follows their lives, their families' internments in the internment camps, and also these young men who went to Europe and fought valiantly in France and in Italy. And it's just a fantastic story overall. So I put my little plug in there for that book because I think it told me the story of Pearl Harbor unlike anyone else had ever done. So Japan bombs Pearl Harbor on December 7th in 1941. And now the U.S. is pulled into the war as an allied partner in the war. And they declare war against Japan. So other Axis powers, Italy and Germany, retaliate by declaring war then on the United States. And there's a declaration of the United Nations that's issued by the United States, the UK, the USSR, China, and 22 other countries that formalize an alliance against the Axis power. And now it sort of feels like it's the whole world against Japan, Italy, and Germany. Springing back over to the European side of things, in the summer of 1942, one of the big things that happened is the Battle of Stalingrad. So the Germans are invading Russia, much like when Napoleon invaded Russia in the cold, in the winter. The Germans start in the summer and think it'll be quick, and then end up there all winter and end up getting defeated, and just as Napoleon had. However, the Battle of Stalingrad not only was it a total war battle in the sense that the whole city is destroyed and civilians are, being pulled into the military, but it's also an example of the German blitzkrieg as it starts, as when the Germans arrive in Stalingrad, they start to destroy the city. But by mid-November, it turns into a guerrilla warfare, with really, really terrible street fighting. Here is an example of the Soviets defending a position during the Battle of Stalingrad in that winter. And one of the remarkable things about the Battle of Stalingrad is that it was a lot of the Soviet fighters were women, and young teenage women, at that, young, teenagers, and women in their early 20s. So this photo and the story comes from Blake Stillwell, on a really interesting page on military.com. So when the Wehrmacht approached Stalingrad from the north, he writes, it threatened to bypass all of the city's preparedness defenses. In the northern area, the Red Army had only inexperienced volunteers from the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment. This regiment was poorly trained, undersupplied, had no infantry to support them. The only weapons were these 37 millimeter flat guns that I think you see the women holding there. And the unit was also fully armed by women who were in their late teens and early 20s, as I said. When the 16th Panzer Division of the Nazis began to move into the city from the north during a blitzkrieg, then it came face to face with these young women from this regiment and their guns. And the teenage defenders of Stalingrad had lowered the elevation of their anti-aircraft guns, pointing them right into the oncoming German offensive. So they're using anti-aircraft guns to try to take out German tanks. It was the first resistance that the Germans encountered in their failed 5-month fight for the control of Stalingrad. It doesn't end well for these women, though. 2 days into the fighting, they're fighting against hundreds of enemy tanks, thousands of enemy troops, aerial attacks from the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And according to official Soviet records, the young women of the regiment destroyed or damaged 83 tanks, 15 armored personnel carriers, dispersed 3 battalions of infantry, and downed 14 enemy planes. But the Germans, right, who didn't discover who was manning these guns until they wiped them all out, destroying 37 positions of these fighters. And after defeating the young gunners, the 16th Panzer Division referred to them as tenacious fighting women, which, is, I guess, an odd compliment to get from your opposing force. However, the use of women in battle and their valiant efforts, I think, deserve some highlighting there, as we don't hear too often of that in history. Sadly, though, the women were defeated. Stalingrad was destroyed. I mean, you can see in the photograph here. However, the Nazis lost this battle. In the end, winter ended up being sort of the reason for their demise. The Soviets regained control. They were able to encircle the German forces, much as had happened with Napoleon when he invaded Russia. And by February, the Germans were forced to surrender. By June, the Soviets then expelled the last of the German forces from the Soviet Union. The Soviets, of course, a year later would be entering Germany, and would make a, invade Germany to see the end of the Nazi regime and fly their flag over the Reichstag in this famous picture, which we'll get to this picture again when we get to the end. Our next set of lessons is going to be about the partisans, the Catholic resistance, and Allied invasions in France and in Italy. Okay, stay tuned.